How about some music?
Let's get the music going. The walk-on music for, ladies and gentlemen, Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Great to see you. Thank
Great
you.
to see you.
Thank you.
I didn't get the green memo. I'm a bit
there you
off
go. Yeah.
color here.
Green is for go.
Senator Warren, you've been busy.
I have been.
Okay. All right. I want to do something a little bit different. I want to ask the audience question to come out first. Let's start because
You bet.
the women in this room are the real superstars of American politics
Yes,
and
they are.
democracy. Let's have one come out.
Come on. Woohoo!
Oh, your mic. Let's see.
Senator Warren.
Can we get that mic on? Or switch it out?
Two. Good afternoon, Senator Warren.
Good afternoon.
Okay, my name is Monifa, and I'm from Brooklyn, New York.
Hello, Monifa.
I'm a senior vice president at Moms Rising, working on maternal health.
Yes.
And I'm a proud member of the Movement for Black Lives.
Yep.
And my question is about maternal health. The United States is one of only 13 countries in the world where the rate of maternal mortality is now worse than it was 25 years ago.
Yes, ma'am.
For Black women, the risk of death from pregnancy-related causes is 3 to 4 times higher than for white women, and Black women are twice as likely to suffer from life-threatening pregnancy complications. What will you do to address this crisis that persists independent of education and income?
Oh, great question, Monifa, and I'm so glad you asked it because it is so important. Let me just start by saying, I think everything that happens in government is ultimately about our values. But boy, nowhere do you see it more than measure the values that a country has by how it treats its mamas and its babies. And the United States, for 25 years, has profoundly failed on this front. We have failed our mamas, we have failed our babies, exactly in the ways you talk about. While countries around the world have had more and more mothers surviving childbirth, here in the United States, we're one of only a handful of countries where it's actually gone down. And there is a specific problem, as you rightly identify, for women of color, who are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. And here's the thing. Even after we do the adjustments for income, for education, this is true across the board. This is true for well-educated African-American women, for wealthy African-American women. And the best studies that I've seen put it down to just one thing: prejudice. That doctors and nurses don't hear African-American women's medical issues the same way that they hear the same things from white women. And we got to change that, and we got to change it fast because people's lives are at stake. So I got a plan. Okay. And here's the plan. I know there are a lot of people, and probably a lot of people in this audience, who've been working on this issue. There are a lot of good ideas about how we could raise awareness of it and other kinds of things we could do to study it. But I got another approach that I want to use. I want to talk to the hospitals, is where most of these births take place, and I want to talk to them in the language they understand: money. Because here's the deal. Yeah, because here's the deal. Right now, the way that most medical procedures are treated, including those of childbirth, is that hospitals and the doctors who work for them and the nurses who work for them, that hospitals get fee-for-services. So they get something for the delivery room and something for the recovery room and something for all the different parts, right? And they get it no matter what the outcomes are. So we have an innovation that's been going on now in medicine for a while called bundled payments. And the way it works is, say you go to have your knee replaced. The hospital just gets a lump of money, and then the measurement is, did the person get a knee that they can walk on that's pain-free? Well, here's what I'd like to change right now in maternal health, and that is to say the hospitals are just going to get a lump of money. And if they bring down those maternal mortality rates, then they get a bonus. And if they don't, then they're going to have money taken away from them. I want to see the hospitals see it as their responsibility to address this problem head on and to make it a first priority. And the best way to do that is to use money to make it happen, because we got to have change, and we got to have change now. So that's my plan.
Thank you.
Do you have a second question?
Yeah.
We do. All right, let's bring in our next questioner. Come on out.
Hello, Senator Warren. I'm Chrissy Castro.
Hi, Chrissy.
Hello. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I'm
Yes.
Nakai Dene, born for the Winnebago clan. With this administration, we've seen an affront to tribal sovereignty related to land and resource exploitation, attacks on our treaty rights, and violence against women with jurisdictional issues that have given rise to an epidemic of missing and murdered
Yes.
Indigenous women. If elected as president, what are your plans to uphold and strengthen tribal sovereignty of this land's First Peoples? And how are you going to make it a priority on your campaign?
Oh, thank you. It's a great question. So if we can, let's start particularly with the violence issue. You know, I'm so glad you're here to ask this question, because it's an issue that we need to raise more awareness around missing and murdered Indigenous women. One of the reasons I strongly supported the 2013 Violence Against Women Act was that it expanded the jurisdiction of our tribal governments to be able to deal with violence against women, including violence committed by non-natives. And this was an important expansion. Let me just say, it is critically important now that we reauthorize, again here in 2019, the Violence Against Women Act, and that we expand protection for Native women. But the issue you raise in the larger context about tribal sovereignty is one of the most significant. It is the reminder that we have a government-to-government relationship with tribes across this nation. And we have made, in the United States, our federal government has made promises and treaty obligations that it has failed to honor. The first thing we need to do is go back through our obligations and figure out how we can best honor those obligations. The second is, when we propose legislation, is to look at it through the lens of tribal government, to see whether or not we're actually respecting the tribal nations that are doing the work. And let me give you an example of that. So I have a bill with Elijah Cummings. Some of you may know Congressman Cummings from Baltimore, a good man. That's right, who has, the bill we have is called the CARE Act. And the CARE Act is modeled on the Ryan White CARE Act. Some of you may remember a time back in the 80s when HIV/AIDS, year by year, the numbers were going up, and the federal government would just nibble around the edges, put a little more money and a little more money, and the crisis just kept accelerating. And finally, a little boy named Ryan White declared that he had AIDS, and Congress said, enough is enough. We're going to put the resources that are needed in to be able to knock this problem back. And today, because that was done, there are people all across this country who either didn't contract HIV/AIDS or who are living with it successfully, because government stepped in on the side of the people. Congressman Cummings and I want to do the same thing on the opioid crisis. It is time now. We will lose nearly 200 people today from the opioid crisis. It's like a plane crash, and it will happen again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And if someone who loves you came to you and said, I want help, they would have a less than 1 in 6 chance of getting the help they need. Not because we don't know what to do to help them, but because we don't put the money in, the resources in. We treat it not as a medical problem, but treat it with stigma. Congressman Cummings and I believe it is time to change that. And part of that is to make sure that money goes to the communities that are facing the opioid crisis head on, and particularly carved out in this, that money goes directly to the tribes that are dealing with this problem on the ground. It is a point of respect, it is a point of tribal sovereignty, and it should be a part of every piece of legislation that we consider. Thank you.
Related to the comments about the opioid crisis, many of us, many of our communities suffered for the long-term effects of the war on drugs and criminalizing crack. So when someone in the audience said, what about crack? It's a real thing. There are people who who were criminalized and jailed and other things, and the community is still suffering. So what would you do as president to redress the harms done by the federal government in the war on drugs against our communities?
And the answer is we need both halves. Look, we have a real problem in the criminal justice system, and it is a race problem. We need to address that head on. We cannot pretend that we have a race-neutral criminal justice system. We don't. Study after study shows that for exactly the same crimes, African Americans are more likely than whites to be arrested, to be arraigned, to be taken to trial, to be wrongfully convicted, and to be given harsher sentences. That is a badly broken system, and we need reform of that system from the very beginning to the very end of it.
Senator, you went to the Mississippi Delta. You took your campaign to a non-traditional space, not a swing state, Mississippi.
I did.
What did you learn in the Mississippi Delta talking with those voters?
Well, I went to the Mississippi Delta for 2 reasons. The first one was to be able to talk about a housing plan that I've put out. You know, we've got a housing problem all across this country. We live in America now where there's plenty of housing available if you want to buy a McMansion. There's just not housing available for middle-class families, for working families, for the working poor, for the poor, and for the homeless. And the only way we're going to change that is not housing vouchers. The way we're going to change it is we're going to put real money in from the federal government to build new housing units. I have a proposal to build over 3 million new housing units here in America, in urban areas, in rural areas, and I wanted to be down in Mississippi to talk about this. But I want to tell you a part of that proposal, because it tells you something about how I think we have to think about this problem. My proposal will reduce rents, Moody says, by about 10% across the board by getting more housing and better housing available to people. But the question of home ownership is also tied up in this. You know, across this country, for a long time now, home ownership has been the #1 way that families build wealth, working families do. #1 retirement plan in America, pay off your house and live on your Social Security. It's the one asset people buy that appreciates over time and intergenerationally. So if grandma and grandpa can live in the house until they pass, the next generation gets a boost, and the generation after that, and the generation after that. That's why it should be no surprise to anybody in this room that for decades and decades and decades, the federal government subsidized the purchase of housing for white people. For black people, they discriminated against them. And the method of doing this was known as redlining. So they drew off areas where they said plenty of subsidized mortgage assistance, except in the areas inside redlining. The consequence of that, generation after generation after generation, that's been one of the huge drivers of the black-white wealth gap. Well, we can't be in an America that says, well, you know what? We decided not to do that anymore, so everything's okay now. It's not okay. So look at it this way. Back in 1960, when housing discrimination was still legal, think about that, the black-white homeownership gap, right, between the two was 18 points, right, between blacks and white families. Then along comes the civil rights movement, and by golly, we outlaw housing discrimination, redlining goes away, and I will say this, two very interesting things happen. The black-white wealth gap and the black-white homeownership gap starts to shrink, and everybody starts to buy more homes. So it goes up for everybody does better when everybody does better, right? It's moving up, but the wealth gap is shrinking. This is a good thing. It tells us law matters. And then what happens? Long about the year 2000, right in there, the big banks look over the edge and they say, whoa, look at that community. African American communities, Latino communities, there's some wealth in there. Let's go sell them the most horrible, cheating, lying mortgages possible. That's what they did. And let's see how much wealth we can drag out of those communities. Now, they started figuring out how to make that work. It was the so-called subprime mortgage crisis. And understand, it didn't start with people trying to buy homes. It started with mortgage companies that went to people who already owned homes and helped take those homes away from them. They then targeted seniors who had built up a lot of equity. And over time, they spread it across the country. This is when, by now, we're in the early 2000s, I'm ringing the bell saying, this is coming. We're going to have a crash. People can't, the debt is unsustainable. Millions of people in this country are going to lose their homes. Millions are going to lose their jobs. Millions are going to lose their savings. But nobody in Washington wanted to hear this. I learned a fact. When your ears are stuffed with money, you can't hear well.
Address this.
Can I just do the last part of this?
Of course.
So all I want to say about the last part of this is the 1-2 punch from the housing crash means that today in America, black and white homeownership rates are larger than they were back when housing discrimination was legal. So I got a plan. I do. 3 million new housing units, but here's a core part of that plan. It says everybody who lives or lived in a formerly redlined district can get some housing assistance now to be able to buy a home. It's not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction.
I'm going to ask you a slightly different twist on the question we've been asking everyone, because I think that you've answered a lot of that question in your responses. We are at She the People, this wonderful organization that is empowering women and women of color. But when I talk with women of color in my own life, they'll say, wow, that Elizabeth Warren has great plans. She's got specific plans. She's got great ideas. But there's a fear in a lot of people of color and a lot of women of color that say, after the experience of 2016, they don't have the confidence in the electorate of this country to elect a woman president. They want to vote one way, but their fear says that they may need to flee to the safety of a white male candidate. How do you address?
I think that's called side-eye.
I'm just telling you,
Side-eye.
how do you address people who are not confident? They're not confident the country is willing to elect a woman. How do you address people who may be interested in voting for you, but may be afraid?
Let me just say this about confidence. You bet. Look, this is the heart of it. It's how are we going to fight? Not just individually, but how are we going to fight together? Are we going to fight because we're afraid? Are we going to show up for people that we didn't actually believe in, but because we were too afraid to do anything else? That's not who we are. That's not how we're going to do this. Here's how I see this. I'll tell you how I see it. We got a room full of people here who weren't given anything. We got a room full of people here who had to fight for what they believe in. We have a room full of people here who had to reach down deep, and no matter how hard it was, no matter how scary it looked, they found what they needed to find, and they brought it up, and they took care of the people they loved. They fought the fights they believe in. That's how they got into these seats today. You know, this is how I see it from where I sit. I was in middle school when it's just my mama and my daddy and me. The boys are gone. My 3 older brothers, they've all gone off to the military. My daddy has a heart attack. Everybody thinks he's going to die. He comes back home. He can't work. My mother has never worked outside the home. We lose our family station wagon. My mother is terrified. I hear her at night. I hear her cry. I learn words like mortgage and foreclosure from my parents late at night while I'm supposed to be asleep. And I do remember the day I walk into their bedroom. I'm just a kid, and I see the dress laid out on the bed. You all know the dress. The one that only comes out for weddings, funerals, and graduations. And my mother's standing there in her slip and her stocking feet, and she's crying, and she's pacing, and she's saying, "We will not lose this house. We will not lose this house. We will not lose this house." She was 50 years old, and she had never worked outside the home, and she was terrified. I watched her face while she looked at that dress, and she looked at me, and she looked back at that dress, and finally she reached over and she pulled that dress on. She blew her nose, she put on her high heels, she walked to the Sears, and she got a minimum wage job answering the phones. The minimum wage job saved our home, and it saved our family. Now, let me just say about this. That day, my mama taught me 3 lessons. It took me a while to learn them. But the first one was, it doesn't make any difference how scary it looks, how hard it is out there. You reach down, you find what you have to find, you pull it up, and you take care of the people you love. I learned over time that wasn't just what my mama taught me. It's what millions of people across this country have taught their daughters and their sons through the years. You do what has to be done to take care of the people you love. But the third thing I learned eventually about that story is it's a story about government and how no matter how hard you work, the rules that are made by the people in government will still make the big difference in your life. Because when I was a girl, a full-time minimum wage job in America would support a family of 3. It would pay a mortgage, it would cover the utilities, and it would cover food. Today, a minimum wage job in America will not keep a mama and a baby out of poverty. That is wrong, it is worth fighting for, and it's why we're all going to stay in this.
Senator Elizabeth Warren!
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
Look, a standing ovation. A standing ovation.
Thank you.
We got to do this. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Your slide's up.